Imagine a book that was dismissed for far too long as merely strange. For far too long, it was treated as apocrypha. For far too long, it was pushed aside as a dangerous fantasy at the edge of the Bible. But what if this is the very book that preserved one of the most disturbing explanations for why the ancient world was driven toward the flood at all? We are talking about the Book of Enoch, a text that lived for centuries on the border between sacred revelation, forbidden tradition, and almost forgotten terror. To some, it is nothing more than ancient religious literature. To others, it is the missing key to those few lines in Genesis that are far too brief, far too vague, and far too dangerous in their implications. Because it is there, in that dark pre-flood world, that a word appears which still lands like a blow: the Nephilim. Most people know them only in passing, as strange giants, as half-mythic beings suspended somewhere between legend and theology. But the Book of Enoch paints a very different picture, a much darker one, a much more unsettling one. Here, the Nephilim are not just giants from an old story. They become the trace of a catastrophe, the sign that a boundary was once broken, a boundary on which the entire order of the world depended. And that is exactly why this subject is so frightening. Because if Enoch is telling the truth, then before the flood, humanity suffered something greater than moral decay. Something crossed over, something mixed. Something entered the structure of creation and twisted it from within. What came down from above did not arrive as a blessing, but as a violation. And from that violation emerged a new and monstrous order. A world of violence, forbidden knowledge, and beings that should never have existed at all. For too long, all of this has been treated as a beautiful ancient legend, as poetic religious imagery. But the more closely scholars read the Book of Enoch, the clearer it becomes. This is not simply a fantasy about giants. This is a text trying to explain why the ancient world became so corrupted that it had to be washed from the face of the earth. And this is where the real story begins. Because the Nephilim are not frightening because of their size, not because of their strength, not even because of their brutality. They are frightening as the memory of a moment when the world stopped being safe for itself, when something that should have remained untouchable was broken, when the forbidden became real. And if the Book of Enoch truly preserved the trace of that ancient catastrophe, then the question is no longer whether the Nephilim were merely a myth. The real question is this: what exactly were the ancients trying to warn us about through this text? And why does this story still sound like something humanity was never meant to forget? And this is where the first truly unsettling paradox of the entire story begins. The Bible says shockingly little about the Nephilim. So little, in fact, that the silence itself begins to feel suspicious. Just a few lines, a few heavy, broken fragments of language. And yet behind them stands the feeling of something immense. As if what we are seeing is not the full account, but only a surviving shard of something far larger. As if the ancient text is not telling the whole story, but merely leaving behind the trace of an event people once understood much more fully. And that is exactly what makes the subject of the Nephilim so dangerous. Because normally, it works the other way around. The more important something is, the more carefully it is explained. But here we find an eerie silence, as though the tradition that once surrounded them had already reached us in damaged form, as though only the part that could not be erased completely was allowed to remain. In Genesis, the Nephilim appear almost suddenly. There is no long introduction, no effort to explain in detail who they were, where they came from, or why their existence matters so much that it becomes tied to the darkest threshold of the ancient world, the age before the flood. They are not introduced like an ordinary tribe. They are not described like one more ancient people. They enter the text as a warning sign, as a symptom that something in the world has already gone terribly wrong. And that silence around them is more powerful than any complete description could have been. Because the ancient writers do not seem to be explaining the subject from the beginning. They write as if their first audience already knew exactly what was being implied. Which means that to the earliest hearers, the word Nephilim did not sound like a puzzle. It sounded like memory. The memory of something too well known and too dark to require detailed explanation. Later, as interpreters tried to build meaning around those lines, the arguments scattered in every direction. Some saw the Nephilim as giants, others as ancient warriors, others as the offspring of a forbidden union between heaven and earth, others as the sign of a world that had already slipped out of balance. But the Bible itself seems to stop at the threshold and go no further. And that is exactly the tension the Book of Enoch takes hold of. Because Enoch does what the canonical text refuses to do. It does not leave the reader standing at the edge of a hint. It opens the door. And behind that door, what begins is no longer a passing reference to strange giants, but an almost complete vision of an ancient catastrophe. Fall, violation, forbidden union, monstrous birth, and the slow corruption of the whole world until the flood itself becomes inevitable. That is why the Bible says so little about the Nephilim. And that is why those few lines were enough to keep the subject alive for thousands of years. Sometimes, one crack in a text says more than an entire chapter. Sometimes brevity is not a lack of meaning, but the trace of censorship, loss, or deliberate silence. And with the Nephilim, that is exactly what it feels like. We were left with only the edge of the story, while everything else disappeared into shadow. And if that is true, then the Book of Enoch stops looking like a random later fantasy and begins to feel like an attempt to restore the missing context. Like a text that says, "You were reading the fragment. Here is the abyss it broke away from." This is where the Watchers enter the story, and with them comes the moment after which the world can no longer remain the same. In ordinary religious imagination, the fall of angels often feels almost abstract: rebellion, pride, exile. But the Book of Enoch describes it differently, more concretely, more disturbingly. Here, the Watchers do not merely fall away from the heavenly order somewhere in the invisible heights. They come down, deliberately, under oath, by collective decision, with the will to violate what was meant to remain untouchable. And that is where the real horror begins. Because this is not simply sin in the ordinary human sense. It is the crossing of a boundary between levels of being, between what was meant to remain separate and what became fatally mixed. In this text, the Watchers are not incidental figures or decorative relics of ancient mythology. They become the carriers of the first great violation, the moment when what is higher enters the earthly realm not in service of order, but against it. The Book of Enoch frames this almost like the opening of a catastrophe. This is not a sudden impulse of passion, nor the private fall of a single being. It is a collective act, a conspiracy, a decision made in advance. The Watchers see human women, desire them, swear an oath together, and bind themselves to a shared transgression so that none of them can turn back. That detail matters, because what we are seeing is not chaotic weakness. It is the deliberate destruction of a prohibition. And from that moment, the story begins to move toward the abyss. Because the world of Enoch is built on distinction. Heaven is not earth. The divine is not human. Beings appointed to guard order are not meant to enter into union with what does not belong to them. But that is exactly what happens. And the moment that boundary collapses, all the others begin to collapse with it. A new reality begins to form. One in which mixture becomes normal, and distortion becomes a new form of power. That is why the scene of the Watchers matters so much. It explains that the horror of the pre-flood world did not begin with humanity alone, and not even with the Nephilim as such. It began with a violation from above, with beings tied to the order of heaven, bringing down not protection, but fracture, not light, but contamination, not blessing, but a form of knowledge and power the world was never meant to bear. And that is why the Book of Enoch sounds so dangerous. It offers a picture of evil that is not merely moral failure on the part of man. It is intrusion, the collapse of a cosmic boundary. And the Nephilim are only the consequence of that moment when a door that should never have been opened was opened anyway. That is the true turning point of the story. Because after the Watchers, the world can no longer be described as merely sinful. It becomes damaged in its very fabric. And everything that follows, the birth of the Nephilim, the spread of violence, the corruption of humanity, the approach of the flood, will not be a random chain of disasters, but the logic of one great violation that can no longer be stopped by ordinary means. And from that violation, the Nephilim are born. And this is the point where ancient horror takes on flesh. Because until this moment, evil in the story can still be understood as an act, a decision, a transgression. But with the appearance of the Nephilim, it becomes something material, visible, almost tangible. The violation no longer hangs in the air as an abstraction. It begins to walk the earth. That is why Enoch does not speak of the Nephilim as something merely strange or unusual. They appear as the result of something that should never have happened at all. They do not continue the order of the world. They testify to its rupture. Their birth is not just another episode in ancient history. It is the moment when the corruption itself becomes a living thing. And this is crucial. The fear here does not come only from the image of giants. Their size is merely the outer shell of the horror. The deeper terror lies elsewhere. From the beginning, the Nephilim are described as beings of excess, beings without measure, beings that do not fit within the boundaries of the human world. What they embody is not strength in any heroic sense, but overflow, imbalance, the pressure of something too heavy, too violent, too alien for a world that was meant to remain human. That is why, in the ancient imagination, they are not simply mighty giants. They are the sign that the world has already ceased to be itself. As long as the boundaries held, reality still held together. But once beings born of a forbidden union appear upon the earth, it means the fabric of reality is no longer protected. Something has entered the world that was never meant to take root there. The Book of Enoch makes this feel especially heavy. Here, the Nephilim are not a random anomaly, not a poetic mythical image, not a decorative detail of an ancient tale. They become almost physical proof that the catastrophe has already happened, not in the future, not merely as a threat, but already here, inside the human world. And so their birth is not simply the beginning of a new line of beings. It is the beginning of a new logic of the world. Where there should have been measure, there is excess. Where there should have been boundary, there is mixture. Where there should have been life in order, there appears a force that destroys order simply by existing within it. That is why the Nephilim still disturb people even now. They are frightening not as monsters from legend, but as the memory of a moment when the forbidden already became flesh. It already entered history. It was no longer an idea, a temptation, or a terrible possibility. It had been born. And at that point, one thing becomes clear. After the Nephilim appear, the world of Enoch is no longer moving toward a crisis. It is already inside one. The flood still lies ahead, but the spiritual and cosmic catastrophe has already taken place. The question is no longer whether destruction will come. The only question is how far it will spread before it becomes irreversible. And this is exactly where it becomes clear why the Nephilim are more frightening than many other figures in the ancient world. Because their horror is not in their size, not in brute strength, not even in brutality as such. All of that is secondary. The deeper fear comes from something else entirely. The Nephilim feel like beings that should never have appeared at all. They are terrifying not because they are too powerful, but because their very existence violates the order on which reality itself depends. In the ancient imagination, the world was not structured as chaos. Everything had measure. Everything had a boundary. Heaven was separate. Earth was separate. The human was separate. The divine was separate. That distance is what allowed the cosmos to remain an ordered world rather than a confused collision of forces. And when the Book of Enoch speaks about the Nephilim, it is not merely speaking about terrifying beings. It is speaking about the collapse of that distance. That is what makes their image so heavy. The Nephilim are not simply a threat to humanity. They are a threat to the structure of the world itself. They are like a living memory that the boundaries were already broken once before. And if that could happen once, then reality is not as stable as it appears. Then what seemed like eternal order can be breached. That is what frightens most deeply. That is why the Nephilim do not feel like ordinary monsters from myth. An ordinary monster lives inside the world. It is dangerous, but it still belongs to the same reality. The Nephilim in the Book of Enoch feel different. They seem to come from an error in the fabric of being itself. Not merely strong creatures, but embodied distortion. The sign that the world had begun to produce what it was never meant to produce. And in that sense, they are more frightening than any dragon or giant of folklore. Because a dragon can be an external enemy, but the Nephilim are an internal symptom. They suggest that the sickness is already inside, already in the blood of the world, already in its order, already in man, who has become entangled in that fracture. That is why the subject of the Nephilim has survived for thousands of years. It disturbs not only as an ancient story, but as an archetype, as the fear that the boundary between the permitted and the forbidden may one day disappear, that man may enter into union with something he was never prepared to touch, that knowledge, power, or authority may be received too early, and instead of elevation, bring corruption. That is why the Book of Enoch does not present the Nephilim as a spectacle. It is not saying, "Look at these ancient giants." It is a warning, a terrifying reminder that the world can be destroyed not only by war, sin, or catastrophe from outside. It can be destroyed the moment the right distance between what must remain separate is erased. And if we read them in that light, then the Nephilim stop being an exotic detail of ancient religious literature. They become an image of ultimate dread, an image of a world that once lost its sense of measure and paid for it with everything. But the Book of Enoch goes even further, and this is where the story stops being merely about strange beings and becomes a chronicle of ancient contamination. Because the Watchers bring more to Earth than the Nephilim. They bring knowledge. And that knowledge is not presented as a gift, not as civilizational progress, and not as the light of enlightenment. On the contrary, in the text it feels premature, dangerous, and destructive. Like a power humanity was not yet prepared to receive and was never meant to possess at that stage of its history. That is exactly why the Book of Enoch is so disturbing. It says that the fall did not come only through the flesh, but through the mind. Not only through forbidden union, but through forbidden instruction. The Watchers begin to reveal secrets that had once belonged beyond the human sphere. The arts of war, the making of weapons, the secrets of metals, adornment, magical practices, astrology, incantations, the signs of the heavens, and hidden forces of nature. At first, that may sound strange. Why is knowledge itself presented as something dark? Why do the abilities to make, calculate, understand, and create suddenly become part of the catastrophe? But that is precisely where the terror of the Book of Enoch lies. The problem is not knowledge in itself. The problem is timing, source, and purpose. This knowledge comes too early. It does not come from the right order. It is not given for the sake of building, but for the sake of distortion. It accelerates a world that is not yet capable of surviving its own empowerment. It gives humanity not wisdom, but instruments of destruction. Not maturity, but power without measure. Not a path upward, but a shortcut into collapse. And then one thing becomes clear. The Nephilim are only the visible part of the disaster. Far beneath them lies the corruption of humanity itself. The world before the flood begins to rot, not only because beings appeared that should never have existed. It begins to rot because man gains access to things that deform him from within. War becomes an art. Violence becomes a technique. Beauty becomes seduction. Knowledge becomes a means of stepping outside measure rather than growing into it. In that sense, the Book of Enoch sounds almost modern. It is describing not simply an ancient sin, but a civilizational leap that turned fatal, as though humanity received a power too early, before it had learned how to bear it. And that is why the text speaks of the Watchers not as enlighteners, but as corrupters of the world. This is a crucial turning point, because evil here is no longer merely bodily or moral. It becomes intellectual, cultural, technological. It enters history not simply as vice, but as a system, as the accelerated distortion of the world through knowledge taken from a forbidden realm. And if we read it that way, then the flood in the Book of Enoch no longer looks like punishment for isolated sins. It becomes the response to a world that had learned to destroy itself too efficiently. A world in which forbidden knowledge had already taken root and turned humanity into something that had lost all sense of boundary. That is why this section matters so much. Because after this, the Nephilim no longer appear as the ultimate evil. They are only the symbol. The deeper horror is that with them came a new principle into the world: power without maturity, knowledge without measure, and authority without order. And this is the point where the world of the Book of Enoch stops being merely sinful. It becomes ungovernable. Because after the Nephilim appear, and after forbidden knowledge enters the human realm, evil no longer looks like a chain of individual transgressions. It spreads across everything at once. Not only through human beings, but through the very atmosphere of the world itself. Violence is no longer an exception. It becomes the environment, the new air of the ancient earth. The Book of Enoch paints the pre-flood world as a place where measure has disappeared from nearly everything. The Nephilim do not merely exist. They press down upon the world by their very presence. They consume, they dominate, they destroy. Everything becomes excessive: strength, cruelty, appetite, fear. The earth no longer sustains life in order. It begins to function as a territory of distortion where everything exceeds its proper bounds. And that is what matters most. Because in this vision, the flood does not look like a sudden burst of divine anger. It looks like the end of a process that had gone too far. The world had not simply broken commandments. It had lost its inner form. It had ceased to be what it was meant to be. And once that happens, purification no longer appears as the whim of heaven, but as the only answer still left. That is the terrifying logic of the text. First, the boundary is broken. Then the Nephilim are born. Then knowledge arrives that humanity was never ready to bear. Then that knowledge becomes violence, and violence becomes the common atmosphere of existence. And eventually, history itself begins to move in only one direction: toward the destruction of the old world. That is why the Book of Enoch feels so heavy. It portrays catastrophe not as an accident, but as a consequence. Not as one isolated crime, but as the infection of an entire system. The world before the flood is no longer simply a bad world. It is a world in which destruction has become the normal state of being. And perhaps that is why this ancient story still refuses to let go of us. Because within it, it is easy to hear not only an account of the distant past, but something far more unsettling: the memory of how a civilization can begin to die long before its physical end arrives. Not at the moment of impact, not at the moment of the waters, but at the moment when violence, knowledge without measure, and the collapse of boundaries become the new normal. And in that light, the flood stops looking like the beginning of horror. It becomes its conclusion. And perhaps that is exactly why this story did not die with the ancient world. Because the Nephilim disturb people not only as figures from an old religious text, they disturb us as the symbol of a moment when boundaries were already broken once before, and the price of that collapse was catastrophic. In that sense, the Book of Enoch is not speaking only about the past. It is speaking about a fear humanity recognizes in every age. What happens when we touch what we are not ready for? What happens when power arrives before maturity? What happens when knowledge outruns conscience, measure, and inner order? That is why the subject of the Nephilim feels so modern. Not because people literally expect the return of ancient giants, but because the logic of the story remains terrifyingly familiar. First, the boundary is erased. Then, temptation enters. Then, knowledge stops serving truth and becomes an instrument of power. Then, force appears that no longer knows how to restrain itself. And only after that does it become clear how far everything has gone. That is why the Book of Enoch survived the centuries. It touches not only myth, but archetype, not only ancient theology, but the human memory of how a world can begin to die from within. Not all at once, not always visibly, but irreversibly, once it loses its sense of measure. And the Nephilim become the clearest image of that terror. They are not merely ancient beings. They are the sign that humanity and the world once approached a point beyond which order could no longer sustain itself. That is why their story does not sound like exotic folklore. It sounds like a warning, a dark reminder that not everything that can be opened should be opened. Not everything that can be received should be accepted. And not every power that descends from above arrives as a blessing. That is the true endurance of the Book of Enoch. It frightens not through details alone, but through its logic. Not only through the Nephilim, but through the possibility of a world in which the forbidden becomes normal and distortion becomes the new law. And as long as that fear remains recognizable, this story will not be forgotten. And perhaps this is where the heaviest meaning of the Book of Enoch truly lies. The Nephilim are not frightening because giants may once have walked the earth. That would be too simple. They are frightening because this story preserves the memory of a world that once lost the boundary between the permitted and the forbidden. A world where power arrived before wisdom, where knowledge outran maturity, where what was meant to remain separate became mixed. And from that mixture, a new and distorted reality was born. That is why the Book of Enoch does not sound like a myth invented merely to frighten. It sounds like a warning. Like the echo of a catastrophe the ancients did not want to retell in full, but could not afford to forget. The thought itself was too terrible, that the world had once fallen so far out of balance that it could no longer be corrected. It had to be washed away. And that is the true horror of the Nephilim. They are not merely beings from a world before the flood. They are the sign that destruction begins long below, long before the waters, long before judgment. It begins the moment measure disappears, the moment the forbidden no longer feels forbidden, the moment humanity reaches for what promises power but delivers only distortion. And that is when one thing becomes clear. The Book of Enoch is not speaking only about the ancient world. It is speaking about any age that may one day begin to believe that boundaries no longer matter, that everything is permitted if it grants power, that knowledge by itself is already salvation. But Enoch leaves behind a darker and far more serious thought. Not every knowledge saves, not every power elevates, and not everything that descends from above comes as light. Perhaps that is why this story survived the centuries, not as a tale about giants, not as a strange religious fragment, but as the memory of a day when the world had already ceased to get for itself. And perhaps the most frightening question is not whether the Nephilim were ever real, but whether we have understood why the ancients were so afraid of the very possibility that they could be.